Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Josh, and for today's interview, I have Nick Srnicek. He is the author of Platform Capitalism and the book Inventing the Future, and as well, he wrote the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics, the last two with Alex Williams. And he's also the co-worker of an upcoming book called After Work, A History of the Home and the Right for Free Time, with his partner Helen Hester, who wrote Xenofeminism. So I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation because, I think you're one of the, one of the founding figures of kind of bringing forth the idea of accelerationism to left-wing political thought. And it's really interesting because I have talked to so many people in the crypto world who describe themselves as accelerationists. And then when I ask them if they've read some of your work, there tends to be like a blank stare and like, oh, who is that? So maybe to start, I thought it'd be interesting if you could perhaps introduce yourself and where you're coming from and the work that you've been doing around accelerationism.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on, by the way. I'm not sure I describe myself necessarily as an accelerationist anymore, and we can maybe get into why that's the case later on. So actually 10 years ago now, Alex and I wrote the Manifesto for an Accelerationist Politics. We sort of kicked off, along with Benjamin Noyes' work, kicked off a lot of discussion about what is accelerationism, what does it mean? I think kicked off some fundamental questions for the left as well. What does the left want? The Manifesto for Accelerationist Politics, it has sort of a weird origin because Alex and I were working on this book, Inventing the Future. We'd been working on it for a couple of years, and we'd been having discussions, particularly with Mark Fisher, about what's wrong with the left, how can it do better? And we were writing Inventing the Future as sort of a response to these questions. And we were asked by a friend of ours to provide, a small text for this little art book that he was putting together. And so Alex and I decided, well, what we'll do is we'll sort of condense what we're doing for Inventing the Future. We'll condense it down, make it highly polemical, like pure manifesto form. And we wrote it thinking that it would be published in this small art collection and like maybe 10 people would see it. What ended up happening, though, was that another friend of ours posted it online, and it just sort of went viral from there, completely unexpectedly. We had no idea that it would hit the nerve that it did, but it did seem to sort of spark a lot of intrigue and controversy and thoughts in people. It was never meant for public consumption in the sort of way that it ended up happening. I think it's probably for the best that we didn't write it for public consumption, because I think it has this sort of unfinished edge to it, and this sort of, we would have added in more nuances and qualifications, and the sort of the real punchiness of it, I think, would have been lost if we'd been writing for the public. It was released, and then we've had 10 years of people declaring themselves to be accelerationists in various ways.
That's a really interesting story. I didn't know that. I sometimes wonder, I kind of like it when at least some kind of what I think are important left-wing political ideas get summarized into more punchy points, just because I think it does tend to attract more people. I think we on the left sometimes have this tendency to be overly academic and then try to add a lot of nuance to things, which makes it less not able to be understood or consumed by someone outside of the circle, I guess. But I guess exactly. It has that double effect of that it goes viral and everybody thinks that they're an accelerationist now.
And it also becomes sort of wildly open to interpretation. These sort of highly condensed formulations that can just be unpacked in different ways. So I think that's part of its success, but it's as an academic, I'm also I'd like to have more qualifications.
Yeah, that's fair. I figured it would be interesting to just recite the first quote for people who maybe haven't come across the manifesto. It says at the very top, it's just like a web page with, I think it's some like 60 points or something like that. Accelerationism pushes towards a future that is more modern, an alternative modernity that neoliberalism is inherently unable to generate. So like from what I understand about accelerationism is that at least, the type of accelerationism on the left is that it's meant to be a answer to neoliberalism, or like to sort of bring to light the things that the left is struggling on during this age of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism has been quite successful in suppressing the left in many ways. And I think we just like haven't really figured out a way, or like a viable path that we can all kind of agree on to like move forward. And that's kind of like the feeling that I had about accelerationism and what it kind of brings. But yeah, then I think maybe it would be interesting to hear from you. Like, what do you think of it now as a concept in this moment, and how have you seen it evolve over the years?
Yeah, so I think that opening quote is a nice little summary. Accelerationism pushes towards a future that is more modern, an alternative modernity that neoliberalism is inherently unable to generate. And I would say, the basic premise builds off of Deleuze and Guattari's work. So they talk about capitalism as this deterritorializing force, particularly relative to feudal relationships, and the ways in which the hierarchies of feudalism get completely broken apart as capitalism emerges and the market forces spread. The point of Deleuze and Guattari's work, though, is that it's not just a deterritorializing force, it also reterritorializes society on new structures, particularly something like wage labor. So the fact that, yes, you're freed from feudal relations, but you're also freed from the means of reproduction. So suddenly you have to go to the market, sell your labor time in order to be able to actually survive under capitalism. And this becomes, the key lynch point of capitalism is that the vast majority of humanity has to go into the labor market in order to survive. They have to generate surplus for capitalists. This becomes what Soren Mowley say, that, it's this mode of domination for capitalism. So yes, capitalism is liberating on one hand, but it's completely constraining and dominating on the other hand. And Deleuze and Guattari say, well, the accelerationist moment is to push beyond that, to sort of unbind these things further than what capitalism would allow. And that's what Alex and I took as the basic sort of premise of accelerationism, is that actually capitalism, for all its ideology of freedom and innovation and lack of constraint, is in fact a highly constraining system, particularly for the vast majority of humanity. And so our argument is that, to get beyond, we have to go beyond capitalism in order to actually bring about this sort of full system of freedom and opportunity and actual dynamism. So yeah, that was the basic sort of premise we took from it. And then, yeah, we've sort of had, strategic thoughts about, well, how do we do that? And this is where the focus on wage labor becomes quite important. And then crucially, the focus on automation, things like universal basic income, shorter working week. Basically, if wage labor is the key sort of linchpin of the capitalist mode of production, or, one of the key linchpins of the system, undermining that little, structural element can have drastic effects and can really lead to the potential for a new system. And so that's why a lot of our focus has been on work and wage labor and automation and things like a basic income and a shorter working week, is because that to us seems to be one of the strategic points that you can really leverage and focus on to try and, extract ourselves out of capitalism and into something better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have so much to say about that. So for people, in case they don't understand, maybe it would be worth defining a bit because they can be complicated terms and concepts for people, deterritorialization and, territorialization.
Yeah. So, I mean, the simplest way to sort of think about it without going into like massive Deleuzian metaphysics in any way, deterritorialization, you can sort of think of as a rigidly hierarchical social system, or a rigid social system. It doesn't necessarily have to be hierarchical, but a rigid social system which is suddenly starting to change and become something else. it's not just a social system necessarily. So they'll also talk about, sort of the nature of the self, the nature of identity, and the ways in which it becomes territorialized and the way in which it becomes rigid. But deterritorialization is sort of the process of that becoming something else.
Right.
And so the argument is that the feudal system was based upon, sort of a lord-peasant relationship and, ultimately peaks at the monarch. That sort of system of feudal relations and, relationships of bondage and debt and things like that. That social system was massively transformed by the emergence of capitalism, particularly in England and then elsewhere around the world. But yeah, market relationships tend to get rid of that feudal relationship of of bondage and debt, at least in the form that it took in feudalism. But then you start to have this nominal equality of people. So everybody is free to go and find whatever job they want. They're free to enter into any contract that they want. This is the ostensible equality and freedom of capitalism. But of course, in reality, that's not actually the case. You can't pick and choose exactly what job you want. You might have a selection of jobs. And of course, there's massive differences between, people's income, people's wealth that they rely upon, and then the massive, class divide between workers and owners of capital. So that becomes the new rigid system of capitalism, is that sort of class divide and its expression in a variety of different ways under capitalism.
Right. So I understand it, maybe quite crudely, that there is a territory always exists. There are always as a existing social structure, and that is the territory. And under feudalism, we had the nobility and whoever else, and then with the sort of growth of capitalism as a mode of production and sort of the bourgeois class of people who were previously the artisans, they were able to push on that social structure and change it over time. And that changing happens in two directions. One is the removal of the existing social structure, and then the other is the creation of new social structures. And so that's deterritorializing is the removal, and then reterritorializing is the creation of a new social structure. And so this is important. I think it's just and it's an interesting conceptual framework to think about things that that other thinkers have kind of already identified, I think, in different ways. I think it's Schumpeter who had this idea of creative destruction, which is also kind of, I think, a very similar thing, although he was speaking about it specifically within capitalism. There is creative destruction where through the competition of capitalist forces, et cetera. But this is a really important concept, I think, for the left to understand, perhaps, in order to think about to understand the process in which, if we want to change the system, this is kind of broad, abstract concepts to understand how that would happen. We have to destroy social structures and create new ones at the same time. We have to reterritorialize into something else, similar to how capitalism did that to feudalism, I guess. I don't know. Does that sound correct? Am I off?
Yeah. I would agree with that. And I think it is sort of it's these big historical questions about the shifts between different modes of production. And that's fundamentally what particularly Marxist thinking is interested in. How do these changes, how have they historically happened? And crucially, the strategic question of how might they happen in the future?
Right.
And is the model of feudalism to capitalism, is that a model for capitalism to communism, or is it going to be something different? But yeah, there is, I think one of the important points of the accelerationist claim from Deleuze and Guattari is that capitalism is a massively constraining system. It's a system of domination and oppression and exploitation. It's not this system of freedom that its proponents want to present it as.
Yeah. I think there are some. It's we may have solved certain problems from feudalism that a lot of people may have, maybe at the time as a peasant, were pointing at as being huge problems. Maybe we have fixed those problems in one way, but we have perhaps created new ones in that process. And I think when it comes to maybe accelerationism in the right now sense, of course, technology is an important part of that equation. I think it's hard to at this moment be like to not think that technology is not important, or that like the innovations and the way and the speed at which technology has changed over the past years, like clearly there has been this deterritorialization or creative destruction happening in our lives, that if you've lived for the past couple of decades, you've like noticed like how the way that we relate to each other has kind of changed with smartphones, with like the internet, with all these things. And so there has been perhaps this destruction of certain social structures, I think, through the internet. Perhaps maybe you could argue that people have become more aware of like their sexual orientation or like their gender identity, because they finally were able to getting to know people who also felt similarly. But at the same time, you know, the internet is a giant surveillance machine. So there's like, you know, but so again, those processes are still happening, and technology is just like right now one of the main drivers of that, perhaps you can say, arguably.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the more controversial points about the Accelerationist Manifesto, is that it did take sort of an optimistic perspective on technology. And I think for a lot of people on the left, particularly amongst academics on the left, you know, the default position is just critical towards technology. And understandably so in many ways, because these are technologies developed by capitalists and then deployed by capitalists and used by capitalists. And, you know, they do serve particular, you know, oppressive and exploitative functions oftentimes. But our point in the manifesto and elsewhere has always been that, well, that doesn't exhaust the potentials of any given technology, that there are potentials beyond just simply what are developed in it. And this is a point from, you know, science and technology studies, which has long shown that the development of technologies doesn't like establish and firmly solidify the potentials of a technology. One of my favorite examples of this is the inventor of the machine gun famously thought that the machine gun was going to end war, because it was just too terrible of a weapon, and people would just be like, well, no, we're not fighting anymore. Didn't happen to be the case, of course, but you know, the developers' intentions and ideas for the designs don't constrain what's possible.
Yeah, that's like not to shill, but in my book I talk about I try to use that framework as well to thinking about blockchain and crypto. But yeah, I think generally there sometimes is this well, I mean, one, the left for whatever reason has a lot of academics one way or another in many ways, and academics love to like question and like love to problematize and whatever I's word you want to say, the ways in which things do or do not appear as they as they seem. I sometimes wonder, like, is it like in some ways I'm just like always back and forth. I'm like, is that a useful thing always to do that? Like, when can we have a place where we can like accept that there is like going to be like nuance and there are answers that we cannot answer right now until we begin to do the thing? Sometimes I think for a lot of people who like, I've met just a lot of people who like are ostensibly progressive, or like that they like internally like they feel like they're on the left in one way or another, even though, but they're not going to read like tomes of political theory or like whatever else. Like they're not going to spend the time doing that. And so like, but at the same time, I think they feel like they can't do anything on the left, like that there is nothing for them to do. So the thing that they do is they go and make a startup or something like that, because like that's the avenue available to them for creating change in some way, or that they feel like they can make change in some way.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's, you know, there is sort of a paralysis amongst the academic left in many ways, and I think, yeah, exactly that desire to do something, the desire to be to have some agency in some way, ends up getting expressed in these weird ways. Oftentimes, sort of turned inwards, you know, vitriol towards the left as well, which is problematic in its own way.
Sure, yeah, and then they call themselves accelerationists. But it's, of course, I think it's like people with good intentions. So, you know, it's something that I try to like, especially in crypto world, I meet a lot of people clearly with very good intentions, but they have not, I think, thought completely through sort of the thing that they're doing and like how it relates to capital or capitalism. It's just that they're just trying to do their best within like the framework that they understand the world in.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I think maybe it would be good to talk a bit about maybe the differences between right and left accelerationism. So there are, I think, from what I understand, there is like this kind of like the story that I know about is kind of like the CCRU in the UK, and how there was this split in which kind of Nick Land was kind of representative of right accelerationism, which from what I understand is like a quite racist one version of accelerationism. And then Mark Fisher, maybe you could say, was like more on the left accelerationist side. But I was wondering if you can maybe elucidate some of that a bit more.
Yeah, I think it's maybe it's actually slightly more complicated, I would say, because I think
Sure.
Mark studied with Nick Land, and there was that whole CCR group, which sort of a massive creative flourishing of ideas, and not just ideas. That people went on to do all sorts of amazing artistic work as well, and scholarly work and all sorts of things. But I think, you have this moment in the 90s, it's the end of history, which everybody sort of mocks nowadays. But at the same time that people were mocking it, it was sort of a lived reality. It was just like, well, yeah, liberal democratic capitalism is the sort of apex of human society. And the USSR is heading towards it. And, China's having market reforms and turning towards capitalism. There was a real sense that capitalism had won, I think, in the 1990s, and that there was no real alternative. And I think what you get in CCRU in many ways is a quite sort of, today we'd call it like an edgelord sort of take on that moment, It's, what can we do with this sort of stuff, and like, what does it all mean? And Nick Land sort of took, Deleuze and Guattari and his work on Bataille and stuff, and sort of said, well, yes, capitalism is the fundamental driving force of human history. Because actually in Deleuze and Guattari's work, all previous human societies have had to actively ward off the emergence of capitalism. As a sort of threat to the social order. And so it's always been this driving force, and then eventually it's unleashed. And he just sort of ran with the idea of capitalism as the active agent of history and said, well, ultimately there are no people, there's no sense of individuals. We're just, we think of ourselves as humans, but actually we're driven by these sort of fundamental biological and social systems, which are completely outside of us and driven by the demands of capital. And, this really sort of, again, a sort of an edgelord take on the end of history. And yeah, people just sort of built upon these ideas and sort of pushed Deleuze and Guattari's work into this end of history moment. And I think at that point, there isn't really a right or a left accelerationism. Because in many ways, it is like, it's not any sort of, it's not any sort of conservative argument in any way. Like
it's an observation.
It's an observation, yeah, in many ways, and it's not marshaled towards, as we see Nick Land doing today. It's not marshaled towards the idea of racial hierarchies or anything like that. This is, the big turn in his sort of thinking. So yeah, it's not right or left in any simple sense at that moment. Eventually, I think. Alex and I sort of tried to argue for left accelerationism, what that might mean. And at the same time, weirdly enough, so Nick Land had disappeared for like 15 years when we wrote the manifesto. He just sort of disappeared off to China. Nobody heard anything from him. I think, he started writing this like column in some Chinese newspaper, which was, if you go back to it, you can find like sort of classic Land. Like there's arguments about, let's take apart the Earth in order to make it more efficient. Like physically take apart the entire planetary mass in order to make it more computationally efficient. And then he's disappeared. We write this manifesto, and then a little while afterwards, he starts to get this more public face, and he's turned into a massive racist, or it's always been there and it's just always been sort of hidden. But you start to get this more clear split between the left and the right accelerationism. So the left saying, well, no, actually capitalism is not the agent of history, and that it's not the final stage of human history. It's not It's not this liberating force that it presents itself as. And then you get Nick Land sort of arguing against early Nick Land, I would say, because early Nick Land is just like any sort of identity, any sort of social structure will just be completely decimated by the progressive force of capitalism. And then contemporary Nick Land is sort of like, well, all that stuff I said about identities and social structures, let's take it back. There is racial hierarchies. And, he starts arguing for this really like, middle-aged conservative sort of argument about the reality of races and the hierarchies involved and all this sort of stuff. The sort of what was once radical about his thinking, I think, has completely disappeared, and he's just become a boomer racist in many ways.
That's very interesting. But yeah, to come from, Nick Land, as far as I understand, I haven't read that much of him because he's quite difficult for me to understand of the work that I've read, but he uses a lot of like left, like he uses like prominent left-wing thinkers and their concepts and ideas in order to come to very kind of weird conclusions, I guess. It's almost like I've heard it described to me as like, I think kind of you said it as well. He's like chosen the side of capitalism. That he's like no, like there is perhaps this somewhat, for some people, can feel maybe perhaps a little bit depressing of an observation to make. And so there's like one side where either you can be maybe like the optimist and say like, no, if we understand it, then we can change it. Or on the other side, you can just be a bit of a more extreme nihilist and say, we can't do anything about it. Embrace like the horrors, I guess, of capitalism, and like it's only going to intensify.
Yeah, exactly. I think chosen the side of capitalist is exactly describes him well.
Yeah, but what's interesting as well is that of all of the like, I guess, most prominent people that I know that would fall under accelerationism, Nick Land is the only one to have written something on cryptocurrency. Like he wrote like the piece on Bitcoin and how it kind of solved the problem of time for capital, something like that.
Yeah, I don't think that piece has aged very well, though. I mean, it was sort of an interesting, provocative piece about the Kantian transcendental and the nature of spatio-temporal manifolds and things, and it's interesting, I think, but it's it doesn't work.
I mean, I think this is so part of the thing that I observe is that it like isn't the type of conclusion that I would want to go to or anything like that, and it's something that I can argue against. But I think because he was like one of the only ones to have written about like cryptocurrency, which has become just like more and more of like a thing that people are interested in, and like I don't know, people kind of like looking for answers about the world. I think that like in crypto world, there's just a lot of people who kind of they are say anti-establishment. They want to see the world to change drastically, and they're looking for answers. And crypto kind of appears as this interesting place where maybe answers could be created. The only kind of like one of the thinkers that they find is Nick Land, I think. And so like they get into Nick Land, and so like now I don't know if you've gone that deep into the rabbit hole, but you have one NFT project called Miladies, which are really into like accelerationist thought from a couple different angles. I don't know too much about them, but I know a lot of them. They have like a very like a lot of them espouse like Landian accelerationism. In like it's hard to tell with a lot of these things. Like it feels like half ironic, but then half like, do you actually believe that? And it seems like they do a little bit. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know those projects in particular. I think there is. I mean, the social media does foster this edgelord sort of personality of just like being provocative for its own sake, and I think that sort of explains part of it. I mean, I think on an optimistic level, I completely agree that I think a lot of people in crypto are anti-establishment, and
Mhm.
there is a positive sentiment there to work with. The existing social order is failing so many people, and it's right to be critical of it. How you attribute the source of that failure determines everything else, really.
Yeah.
But there is a certain positive aspect to that critical stance. Um, yeah, I think as well. You're right about the sort of you get into the cryptosphere and you want to read something interesting on it, and the only stuff that is really written on it is by people from the right, not necessarily just Nick Land, but all sorts of other people from the
Right.
right. And I think the discourse around it is often dominated by those perspectives. And when you go to sort of left writing on the crypto space, it tends to just be complete denial, denunciation of anything of value in it.
Right.
So I think that's it's if you're interested in this technology, the only place to turn often is towards the right.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the things that's kind of missing, like, I think it's fine for people to have their criticisms. I think it's just like politically not useful to kind of outright reject things in the way that has been the reaction with crypto on the left generally. And I think that's kind of why I started, writing and doing podcasts, just because I was like, well, I feel like this is a bad idea, like the way that it's kind of going right now, and somebody has to do it. And I made the unfortunate decision to say, why don't I try and do it? And been trying to put forth like certain things and trying to bring more people in from to see a more, I guess, nuanced picture about it, or to think about it in a slightly different way. That's what I'm hoping what I'm doing pushes in that direction, at least.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's why your sort of work is so important, to be able to have that sort of voice in the space.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the nearly 100 other patrons that contribute financially, which really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. The current bonus episodes have so far explored plenty of topics, including how co-ops and DAOs relate, whether there is a socialist blockchain, a review of previous crypto events I've been to, and recently a video reaction to an episode of the Deprogram. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this episode to help spread the message that blockchain doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our effort into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. So crypto has a lot of people who are, or who say that they are accelerationists in some way. And I'm curious, like, if you have any thoughts as to why you think that is. Like, what do you think it is about accelerationism that would attract someone who's interested in crypto in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think one aspect of it is the sort of the underdetermined nature of the idea. So accelerationism, you say the word and immediately it brings to mind a variety of different things, but it doesn't necessarily point in any one particular direction, left or right, or towards any particular ideology. I think what's sort of happened since the manifesto and the early discourse around what accelerationism is, there seems to be this sort of very memeable quality to the term. Everybody decides their LAC on Twitter, or their RAC, or their UAC, or their EAC, or whatever the case might be.
I've seen many letters before the ACC, and
exactly,
not knowing
exactly.
what they were.
And I think it's largely good. I think the multiplication of variants of it, I think, is sort of a nicely creative moment, even if most of these variants aren't particularly interesting in and of themselves. But I think so that's part of it, is that it's underdetermined as an idea, and therefore it could be picked up by a lot of different people and sort of give a semblance of it being a more coherent long established idea than it necessarily may be. The other sort of aspect is, well, accelerationism. What are you accelerating? The big question I always get, and this is partly why I think the term isn't really useful anymore, because it is. I think it's a fundamentally wrong question.
Yeah.
But if you describe yourself as an accelerationist and you want to say, well, we're going to accelerate something, you could accelerate anything. This is where you get these variants from. You can accelerate whatever you want. It could be artificial intelligence. It could be, it could be crypto. It could be whatever the case might be. So I think this has allowed people to really pick up the idea as well, to say, well, this is what I want, and I want to accelerate this, and therefore I'm an accelerationist of this. And it's clearly a very vulgar idea and interpretation of it, but I think it allows people to try and present themselves as having a particular ideology or identity that they may not otherwise have. It sort of gives a name to something.
Right. So I'm curious, how do you answer that question when you are asked that? What are we accelerating, and why that's the wrong question to be asking, I guess?
Well, it's maybe not necessarily the wrong question. I think it's maybe just it's a misleading question, because I think a lot of people will go on to say to accelerate the contradictions in capitalism in order to heighten the conflict between classes and therefore bring about the revolution. It's the most vulgar version of this.
We need apocalypse first to bring about any good.
Yeah. I think it's a completely naive idea, but some people do hold on to it. Then I would say, if you're accelerating anything, it's freedom. I think freedom is at the heart of Alex and I's work. But freedom is not this sort of, it's not this liberal idea of a completely autonomous subject. In fact, you have to think about the ways in which we're interdependent with each other. But then it's also, this is where I have a lot of problems with sort of classic philosophical ideas of freedom. Freedom is not just something that's contained within us, within our bodies or our minds. Freedom is actually something which is augmented by technologies. So, in Inventing the Future, we'll talk about synthetic freedom. Freedom is something which actually has to be built. It's not something that you take away constraints and it's just lying there waiting. It's something which requires the building of proper institutions, proper social systems, but then also proper material infrastructure in order to be able to actually expand freedom universally. So freedom is not just a matter of accelerating freedom is not just a matter of giving some people more freedom, but also giving everybody freedom, like an absolutely universal take on this idea. So this is where, I think a lot of our optimism, or maybe not optimism, but our hope for technology comes from, is that, technology does allow you to do new things, more things. And so, you have to think about it as part of the project of freedom, of expanding freedom.
I love that. I can't wait to use that in a conversation. It makes me think of I don't know. I don't know. I guess it appeals to maybe the sensibilities of someone who is I don't know, who considers themselves to be more on the right or something like that. One of the other ways that I've heard it kind of described is also that it's not about accelerating something. It's the acknowledgement that things are accelerating. That it isn't necessarily a program in itself, but that things are already accelerating and we need to respond to it in some way. Kind of how I've done it.
I think that's partly the unconditional accelerationist approach from what I can gather. It ends up being a very fatalist approach, because it just says, well, capital does what capital does, and we're just here along for the ride. Political action is impotent. Any sort of human agency is basically, an illusion. Therefore, we're here for the ride of capital. And again, I think it's a quite provocative argument and interesting for that. But I don't agree with it. And I don't agree actually that our contemporary system is accelerating. If anything, I think it's slowing down. Which sort of goes against, I think, the phenomenological sense that we have of things speeding up and changing rapidly. But actually, if you look 100, 150 years ago, the ways in which things were changing during the Industrial Revolution was massively more significant than what we have nowadays. So if you look at a variety of measures, whether it be like crude measures of technological progress, like how many patents are being applied for and used, it's been decreasing since the 1970s. Economic measures like productivity, which basically say, well, how much is the economy changing? How much are we automating of it? Productivity growth has been declining since the 1970s. Economic growth for the leading countries has been declining since the 1970s. We're heading towards a period of more and more economic stagnation, and I think technological stagnation in a weird way as well. We have smartphones now, but that's like the only major new innovation until recently, I would say, with artificial intelligence. But even smartphones are based upon technology we discovered in World War II. It's not like some fundamental rethinking of things. It's just sort of taking components we've already had and putting them together in different ways.
Oh, interesting. That observation, I imagine, like appeals to a lot of like, I guess, like petit bourgeois sentiments that like things are slowing down, and if you're like a sort of small scale entrepreneur, then like that seems bad to you because you won't be able to break into like the stratosphere of of like the bourgeois class. You'll be forever stuck sort of like at the bottom of the top, I guess. And maybe I think there is like a certain those type of conditions can create certain sentiments in people like that. And I think there are quite a few people like that in the technology space.
Yeah, one other thing I find interesting, just on sort of that point, startups. We think we think there's a multitude of startups, like new startups nowadays, but actually new business formation has been, again, in decline since the 1970s. It's weird. It's almost like something happened in the 1970s, this epochal crisis of capitalism, which still hasn't fully been resolved. Neoliberalism was the attempt to resolve it, and it did resolve it in some ways, but these fundamental indicators of technological change and economic growth have all been in decline for decades now.
Interesting. I wonder, so like what I find really interesting is on the left, we'll say everything changed in the 70s because of the start of neoliberalism and neoliberal economic policy. And then I hear a lot on the right, they'll say everything changed in 1970 because we moved away from the gold standard. And like they there's like a website, what happened in 1972 or whatever, which all is just like gold standard ended and then everything plummeted. And I think it looks very convincing for a lot of those types of people, because it's also more difficult to explain like neoliberal economic policy that happened in the 1970s at the same time. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I mean, the 1970s were momentous. And, I think the 2020s might be as momentous, but we'll sort of see. But I think there's so many things going on that it leaves itself open to a variety of different interpretations. Again, what is the source of the problem? We can all agree that there's a problem, but what is the source of it? I think just on the gold standard point, I mean, there's a reason that countries left the gold standard during the Great Depression is because it was decimating their economies. It didn't allow for the freedom of things like exchange rate policy that would mean that you didn't have to have half your country unemployed in order to meet your foreign exchange requirements. The gold standard failed. Like, it's a failure, and for very good historical reasons. And I would just encourage anybody who thinks that the gold standard is a savior to sort of look into that.
Yeah. Don't believe the bullshit that is generally kind of implied by people like Balaji and these other venture capitalists who are, kind of espouse, like, that are very popular in the crypto world, that espouse this idea quite often. So accelerationism, it has a more, let's say, I don't know if like positive is the right view, but like a more accepting view of like technological innovation or progress. But of course, right now there has been sort of like other trends within the left, as you have people who call themselves or who are interested in degrowth. So they're, I don't know too much about it, but from what I understand, they're interested in kind of slowing down everything kind of generally as a way to deal with the climate crisis, to kind of stop that we don't necessarily need new technological innovations to solve our problems, but that we can just slow down growth to decrease our like output of greenhouse gases. And then you also have people who call themselves maybe like neo-Luddites. So they would point to the tradition of the Luddites in the UK, in which a bunch of workers had destroyed, I think they had like just bought like new machines for these people who were making clothing. And the new machines would then like cut half of their workforce. So they destroyed the machines and started this movement for a short while. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on like these movements and whether or not they are, I don't know, are they not as against or anti accelerationism or something, or whatever you want to call it, as maybe they seem? I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're not necessarily as opposed as it might seem. I mean, the neo-Luddites, well, the original Luddites, were just simply workers fighting for their livelihoods against technology as the most obvious figure of capitalist relations. It wasn't necessarily a fight against technology. It was a fight against the capitalists who were installing these technologies.
Yeah.
And I think the neo-Luddite approach, at least the ones that sort of take that, that facet of worker struggle as central, I have absolutely no problem with it. I think I do have a problem sometimes the neo-Luddites can tip over into being just blanket criticism of any technology whatsoever. I don't think that's right, but I think there is a lot of value in the ideas. Degrowth is interesting because actually I think suitably interpreted, I find myself in agreement with almost all of it. And that might sound strange, but here's the sort of thing: is like you have on one hand the debate seems to be between degrowthers arguing, okay, yes, well, we need to completely let's put it in this crudest form: we need to stop economic growth. And then you have, on the other hand, eco-modernists who say, well, technology will solve all the problems. It'll solve all the climate issues. We can do carbon capture. We can do geoengineering. We can do anything. We don't need to change our livelihoods whatsoever. We can just keep going. And I think there's partly this debate between the two gets lost in the fact that neither is really talking about what timescale they're talking about. Because I think eco-modernism rightly points to the fact that the planetary limits that we have right now for resource use or whatever the case may be, the planetary limits are not fixed, that they're actually variable. They're based upon, at least in part, how efficiently we use technologies and where are we getting our energy from and these sorts of things. So I think, given the potential for technology to change those planetary limits at a certain point in time in some certain future, who knows how long, I think the eco-modernist argument that we don't need to change our livelihoods could be right. It's not right. It's not correct at the moment, though. And this is where sort of degrowth comes in and says, well, we do need to actually change a lot of our habits. We need to think about, how much meat are we eating? How many cars are we driving? These sorts of things. And I think they're absolutely right on all of those questions. Fundamental to any question of the future is, well, is the future livable? I think climate change is like the foundational question upon which any other sort of political question has to be set upon. So I think degrowth is right in a lot of ways. And I think crucially, they're right in the sense of economic growth, particularly as measured by GDP, is a terrible metric for progress. So they talk about ending economic growth. And I think if you interpret that to mean, let's not focus on GDP growth, I think they're absolutely right. Let's focus on some other measure of growth, which is why I'm not a big fan of the term degrowth, because I think they do want growth. They just want growth in a different sense. So degrowth is not necessarily the best way to phrase that. The other thing I would say is that I think in the most sensible, sophisticated versions of degrowth, you also get a sense that high technology can be used to solve the problems that we face. And that it's not just a matter of like a blanket rejection of technology, but in fact of using technologies in the most effective and collectively determined ways. The big problem is that we have technologies that are deployed by capitalists for capitalist purposes, without any sense of any sort of climate externalities or anything like that. But if we have collective determination over the development and use and deployment of technologies, suddenly I think the question becomes much more interesting. And I think there's another sort of divide here you get between eco-modernists who will argue that we need big, high technology all the time. And then you'll have others who will argue, well, we don't want any technology. Technology is not the answer. And I think actually the answer is really we need sometimes small-scale technology. But it can be really high tech, but it could be local, it could be small scale, solar panels on roofs versus a massive single solar power generating plant. They're both high technologies, but eco-modernists would want the big solar plant rather than sort of distributed solar panels on people's roofs. So I think, degrowth at its best will say, yes, we need to make use of technologies, but we need to use it consciously, and we need to think about, the climate costs that are involved in these sorts of things as well. We can't just simply say, yeah, electric cars for everybody without thinking about lithium, for instance, and the ways in which lithium extraction is devastating to communities and climates around the world. So yeah, I have a lot I enjoy in degrowth, even if I think the term itself is, it leads people astray.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it's I think there's a negative reaction because of the term degrowth, because it seems like it. Because I've heard people describe it as like almost implying like an austerity, that it could fit quite well within like a neoliberal framework of austerity because we're degrowthing, like we're decreasing your living conditions because, well, we have to fix the climate. Which is not like a positive political vision, I guess.
Yeah, and particularly when, significant parts of the world haven't seen wage growth and have seen austerity for the past, 10, almost 15 years now. To try and sell people a left version of austerity, I think is incredibly difficult, and I think is also it's far too pessimistic about what's possible.
Maybe they just need to change it to like just use the whole meta thing, just meta growth. Just remove the D, maybe. And then everyone would be like, okay, let's do that now. A rethinking of growth. Okay, yeah, I think that's really. I just like really. I think in my ideal world, it would be to where the left has much more organizational capacity and governance within itself to be able to have these types of conversations or like debates or discussion, to be able to like to synthesize more of these various ideas coming from different places that aren't necessarily as opposed as they like seem to be. I think people just have a tendency to be like, there's this thing, there's that thing, there's that thing, and they're all like contradictory to one another, and they're not going like, they're all fights amongst themselves to have a bigger share of the pie or whatever else, rather than kind of like, I don't know if it's necessarily communization, but like just coming together to like a more coherent framework that no like single movement or single framework can possibly encompass everything.
Yeah. I think the incentive structures of, well, particularly social media, but also academia, sort of militate against this, though, because academia requires you to distinguish yourself from others, and social media, engagement is dependent upon being provocative and controversial and like antagonistic. What I do find is that I think the sort of slow decline of Twitter is going to foster this more, but the movement towards more small scale sort of private internet groups. The Discord, I think, is a pretty good example. There's a lot more smaller sort of groups on Discord, where it's not just everybody in the world goes onto one single social media platform, and then the complete loss of context that happens with that sort of thing. I think smaller scale internet communities are you do get these sort of productive discussions, at least in my experience.
Yeah, definitely. I find that also like, I don't know, people, I mean, one, they use the internet differently in different contexts. I think also like my experience with using the internet, I mean, just like within the left, of course, is that you have like anytime I would bring up, for example, cryptocurrency, I would get like an instant kind of barrage of like, you're a scammer, what are you trying to sell us? Da, da, da.
Yeah,
And I'm like,
yeah.
I'm just trying to have like a normal conversation about it. Why can't we have that? But it gets shut down like quite fast, and we can't like. There's no like. So I had to create my own little pocket of the internet to build a community just to talk about like this intersection of weird things, because neither side like necessarily wants to talk about the other one.
Yeah,
I do
yeah,
find it like
exactly.
quite like it's been very productive in that way to like have that safe space rather than trying to force everything into the void, I guess.
Yeah. I think the desire to be popular and get like massive engagement on social media is such a fool's game in the end.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so your new book, maybe we can talk about that. It's called After Work: A History of the Home and the Fight for Free Time. It's coming out with Verso. Do you want to tell us a bit about it and how it relates to this maybe this conversation that we're having?
Yeah, so it's out soon. I wrote it with my wife Helen Hester. We started it. Well, I should say Helen started it back in 2015 or 2016. She gave a talk on what ended up being sort of the basic foundation of the book, and the core sort of problem of the book is to say, well, we had a lot of post-work thinking recently, thinking about how we can use technology to increase free time and liberate people from drudgery and from work. Um, but a lot of that thinking, if not, almost all of it, has been focused on waged work, and particularly waged work which is done by men. So we'll talk about automating warehouses and offices and factories and truck driving and things like this. But we'll never talk about nurseries or care homes or hospitals in the same sort of way. So you've got this sort of this real void in the discussion around post work is focused on one type of work but completely neglects this other type of work. You get feminists which then point that out. They say, well, you haven't talked about this work, but almost always feminists will say, actually, post-work ideas can't really be applied to care work, to reproductive labor. So, do we want robots actually looking after our children?
Right.
Most people don't. The vast majority don't. So, basically just the discussion ends there. You've got post-work on one hand, and you've got reproductive labor on the other hand, and they don't seem to combine in any easy way. And the book is to say, well, they can be combined, and they need to be combined, but you have to modify both of them in different ways in order to get them to work together. And so that's what we try and do. We try and set out how post-work ideas that are fighting for more free time, how can that be applied to care work and reproductive labor in general?
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. So how do we combine? Are we should we give our babies to the robots or?
Well, there's one way in which we already do give our babies to robots, which is television. We plop our children in front of TV, so we can do the laundry or make dinner and stuff like that. So yeah, we do automate childcare already, and I think that's an underappreciated point: is that it has already been automated in many, many ways. The one of the challenges that we come up with in the book, building on this scholar Ruth Schwartz Cohen. So she wrote a book back in, I think it was 1982, if I remember correctly, called More Work for Mother. And it basically looked at the history of changes of technology within the home from like the 1870s to the 1970s. And it was, in her own words, an industrial revolution of the home, a massive change, the introduction of washing machines and dishwashers and, running water, plumbing and electricity, all these things. The home of the 1870s was massively different from the home of 1940s, 1950s, hugely different. The surprising thing that she found, though, was that when she looked at how much work people were doing in the home in the 1870s versus the 1970s, it hadn't really changed. if anything, for some people, it was actually increasing over that time period, which sounds really bizarre because you would think that dishwashers are going to save you time, washing machines are going to save you time, but for some reason they didn't. And the book is a lot of discussion about, well, why was this the case? And so our book builds a lot on that. Why wasn't this the case? One of the key answers has to do with, I won't try and give away our whole book right now, but one of the key reasons why was the ratcheting up of standards around things like cleanliness and hygiene. So yes, you could wash your clothes much quicker with and much easier with a washing machine, but now you're expected to do it every few days rather than like once a month, which might have happened beforehand. In the words of one scholar on this, laundry went from being a weekly nightmare to like an endless drudgery. It was just always there. So this ratcheting up of standards meant that, put it in economic terms, productivity was increased, but output also increased. So we're doing more and more laundry. And you find this everywhere. But then in the book, we also talk about the sort of the forcing of all this work onto individual homes and individual families, the massive duplication of effort that goes on every single night in people's homes, the cooking of meals and things like that. All these things which could be done in much more time-effective and resource-effective ways that are just completely gone because we've got a society which demands the single family home as its model. And then we talk about, what might the alternative be? And Vienna is a good inspiration for a lot of this stuff. The sort of model of social housing they have there offers a lot of examples. There's all sorts of ways in which we can try and reduce the work of reproductive labor without reducing the care and without just simply automating it to robots.
So then I imagine part of it is just like kind of like the privatization of care. Could I say that? Like that people are expected now to, whereas maybe in the past, like you would have children, like maybe in your village or your tribe or whatever, and they have what is the phrase, like it takes a village to raise a child or something like that. That was something embodied more in like earlier human civilizations, whereas today it's expected like you personalize your child, or like, you have like a privatized ownership of your child and how what you input into them and what you get out, and you're expected to give them the best of everything in such and such way. And you can only do that by you yourself kind of providing everything for them rather than kind of having a more, I don't know, socialized form of taking care of children.
Yeah, exactly. And I think ownership is exactly the right framework for what's going on right now. Like there's so much implied and often explicitly, actually, the idea that the parental-child relationship is like a relationship of ownership.
Right.
And in fact, owning an asset of human capital is effectively what the parental relationship has become. And then what follows from that is, well, you have to invest in that asset and you have to, put time and money into your little bundle of human capital.
Right.
And that's the way childcare is seen so often nowadays. Rarely explicitly will parents say this, but they do act that way. And if you go to policy people, they do talk literally about children being human capital, and we need to invest in them to get a good return on investment. It's just the way these things are seen. It's a quite mutated form of childcare, I think, and parental-child relationships nowadays.
Right. Yeah, I think the lack of realization that the social structures that we have today are quite new and have not been like tested long term, I guess, and the expectations of them are quite strange, actually, in human history. But I hate this term human capital. It's like, it drives me nuts. A company I used to work for had an entire department called human capital, and I don't know. Every time I heard it, I was going insane. I like couldn't believe people were just like, and that was supposed to be like on the surface level, kind of like, I don't know, the more happy department. It's human capital. It drives me nuts. But yeah, it's true. I mean, and we are already treated as capital or as being part of the process of capital in many ways as it exists. Now it's just kind of like creeping more and more into, like, as workers we are, and it's creeping more and more into everything else. And in a world where if you have decreasing maybe social welfare benefits, then it's like you better hope that if you don't have the money yourself, then better hope that your child will, help you survive through retirement.
Yeah, exactly.
I imagine like this must have come out of like your own experience of having a family. Like, I don't have one, so I can only observe.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So Helen and I have 3 children now, but when we started writing the book, we didn't have any children.
Did you have? Were your kids like to help you write the book?
It definitely didn't help, but we were. I was looking back at the initial contract we signed for the book, and it was supposed to be done before our first child was born. That was the idea. It's like we would get the book out before we had children. That didn't happen, and then 3 children later, we finally finished it. Many sleepless nights later. But yeah, I mean, they've been, instructive in their own ways about the burdens of childcare, but also the massive joys involved, and even the ways in which the apparent burdens of childcare can become their own source of joys in completely bizarre ways that you might not expect. But yeah, I think it's given us a very nice perspective on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I imagine it must have shifted some things by having that experience.
Yeah.
Another kind of aspect about like when I read the title of your book that I don't know if you had like commentary on, but one of the things that I think a lot of people notice is that there has been this creeping and accepting that more and more of our time should be doing things that make us money. That like, if you look, like you go to any like kind of like what do you call it, like a hustle culture type of video, it's like you gotta have your job and you gotta have a hobby that makes you money in order to like really make it in life. I imagine this has to be like, I mean, this is just like a very bizarre thing that people have kind of just like accepted as being reality, as being like an okay thing that everybody needs to do,
I think hustle culture is like ideology in its purest modern form. Because I think, what it's effectively doing is it's saying to people who are in positions of like struggling to make money and struggling to make ends meet, typically, it's saying to them that you just need to work harder in order to be able to make ends meet. It's explaining their situation to them. You haven't worked hard enough. It's sort of raising them up above others. It's saying, well, you work hard and you'll be able to be a success, and everybody else is lazy compared to you. So there's this sort of like this hierarchy that emerges within it. And then it justifies the sort of endless slog that is necessary in order to work in capitalism today. So it's ideology in its purest form. It just justifies the existing state of affairs. Yeah.
It reminds me of like I think Gramsci talking about hegemony and like imposing kind of the cultural standards of the elites onto like down in order to like have people comply or think or normalize kind of like the social structures of the elite in some way as being like the ideal way of living or of being, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, it's the reality of so many people's lives. Your primary job doesn't make enough money. You need to go and drive a taxi on the weekends. You need to be a delivery driver. You need to do all these other things in order to make ends meet. It's the reality.
Yeah. But as far as like its relation to accelerationism is the idea that there has been this kind of like like increased use of technology in certain ways, and many ways it has not necessarily produced the way that technology has been introduced and used in the privatized home has not induced the type of gains that you would expect, but that basically we can live a life in which we do care for our children in the ways that we want to, in the ways that are necessary for a human to become an adult, while still being able to reduce the amount of drudgery that we are succumbed to, I guess.
Yeah, I think it is possible. But I think probably not possible under capitalism. I think one of the interesting things we come across in the book is long histories of, more sort of communal groups of people. Thinking of, for instance, like the Quakers in America, these small communities who end up living together, and the massive inventiveness that people have towards the domestic sphere when they're given the opportunity to. Numerous technologies developed by these communities to try and make the domestic drudgery much, much easier, and to alleviate a lot of that burden. But we don't have, for the vast majority of us, we don't have the time or the resources to be able to actually do or think about these things. Mm-hmm. So, part of the alternative is to give people those technologies, to give people the ability and the capacity and the necessary environment and resources to be able to develop their own ways of alleviating burdens. There's history is littered with these examples, but they're driven by people on the ground, users, workers, individuals, rather than by sort of top-down corporations trying to sell you a product.
Yeah, fair. Is there any last things you would like to mention before we close it off?
No, I think that's about it. I think, I will say, I think sort of situating after work within the longer sort of accelerationist history, I think, it's again focused on this idea of freedom. And free time is fundamental, like foundation for freedom. Freedom isn't found when you've got a boss hovering over your shoulder telling you what to do, or today you've got an app telling you when you need to be at some place. That's not freedom. Freedom fundamentally comes from outside of work. It comes from free time, and so the book is a way of trying to argue and think about ways in which we can expand freedom, not just through wage work, but also through this unwaged reproductive labor.
Nice, yeah. Freedom comes from free time. I think that's a nice, succinct, phrase or argument to put forth towards your hustle culture friends or something. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Nick. Really great to be able to talk to you. Is there anything you'd like to leave with the audience? Like any plugs? Where can people find the book? Where they can find you?
You can find the book wherever you want. It's in all the usual spots. I'm sure it'll be pirated soon as well, so I'm sure you can get it for free if you need to as well. Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Of course, yeah. Thanks so much.